Santo Trafficante Jr. was a very shrewd operator, and he was also very well respected.
He was a mafia don who was smart enough to avoid the limelight.
Florida in the mid-1950s was the international gateway to the Caribbean, and it was ruled by one man, Santo Trafficante, a mob boss who turned the neighboring island of Cuba into a gambling paradise.
He was very powerful. He had a lot of connections. He was the natural selection, the natural choice to be sort of the go-to guy when it came to Cuba.
Trafficante was propelled into success by his influence among higher offices and relationships with the likes of Fidel Castro and JFK.
Trafficante definitely was hedging his bets. He was paying off the Batista officials and the government, but at the same time, he was giving money to the guerrillas and to Castro and their causes.
The fact that he came up with money and helped JFK win went by the board.
Felled on the verge of becoming the wealthiest mob boss of them all, he thought he was betrayed by one head of state and then another, and so he plotted their downfalls.
Nothing's more sensational than the assassination of the president.
This is Mafia. The world was shook on November 22, 1963, when, on an official visit in Dallas, Texas, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in broad daylight. The assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself killed a few days later by a man named Jack Ruby. Scott Dietschy is author of a biography of Trafficante, The Silent Dawn.
Initially, Ruby said that he was doing it because it was his patriotic duty, and it wasn't until a few years later that his Underworld ties really became known outside the Dallas area.
From the beginning, the two murders were suspicious, and so the government set up several commissions investigating Kennedy's death. The first, known as the Warren Commission, began days after the assassination. In less than a year, the Warren Report concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone and that his motives were merely political. Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, had also acted alone. But the report immediately came under intense scrutiny. Critics said the report felt rushed, the details murky. Selwyn Rabb, author of The Five Families.
It was obvious to many people it had been done very flimsily. It wasn't a really solid report. There are many questions that arose later and led to House and Senate investigations into what really happened.
And for over a decade afterward, the idea that Oswald was acting alone just didn't sit well with the public. The press reported on rumors that Oswald had been working for the CIA, that he had been working for the Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, or even that he had been working with the mob. 12 years after the Warren Report, in 1976, a House Select Committee on Assassinations was formed to reinvestigate the death of John F. Kennedy.
And one of the evidences that came up 10 years after the Warren Commission report were all these FBI bugs and tapes showing that the Mafia talking before and after about getting rid of John F. Kennedy. So there was an obvious need to look into whether or not the mob had a direct or indirect hand in killing the President of the United States. It was a must-go.
I like to look good. When I'm here in the studio, let's face it, I can wear whatever I want. No one can see me. But when I'm out and about, I care about how I look. So I just ordered a new blazer from Indochino.com. It's not at all like buying something off the rack at a department store. You're ordering a customized piece of clothing made to order to your exact measurements. They have a ton of high-quality fabrics, and you can personalize all of the details. Lapel, lining, pockets, even a monogram. I'm getting the classic black and white houndstooth with 2 buttons, notched lapels, and no pocket flaps. Here's how you can get a custom-tailored suit from Indochino. Visit a showroom or shop online at Indochino.com. Pick your fabric, choose your customizations, submit your measurements, sit back and wait for your custom suit to arrive in just a few weeks. And this week, Mafia listeners can get any premium Indochino suit for just $379 at Indochino.com when entering Mafia at checkout. That's 50% off the regular price for a made-to-measure premium suit. Plus, shipping is free. Did I forget to mention that? That's Indochino.com, promo code MAFIA, for any premium suit for just $379 and free shipping. It's an incredible deal for a suit that will fit you better than anything off the rack ever could. In September 1978, Florida mob boss Santo Trafficante was called in to testify. Trafficante, the head of the Florida Mafia and one-time king of Cuba's casinos, was believed to know something about the death of JFK. Scott Dietschy.
For Trafficante to appear in front of the committee and actually testify was pretty unusual. He certainly shunned and avoided the spotlight. He was never one to be very loquacious. He was very quiet, circumspect. So that was definitely pretty unusual for him.
Both Oswald and Ruby had direct connections to Cuba. And somewhere in the middle of this web of intrigue sat the old Cuban racketeer, Santo Trafficante. Attorney Robert Blakey was chief counsel of the Select Committee on Assassinations.
So, if you take his connections and trace them out in like a concentric circle, it looks like organized crime in some sense were responsible if it were conspiratorial. If it were just Jack Ruby in a crazy burst of patriotism, if you want to call it that, then it's just two single assassins. If you take the associations of Oswald and run them out, they go back to the Soviet Union or communism. And now you have the irreconcilability of left-wing communist and right-wing mafioso. It's a bewilderment.
But the question was, who exactly was this Trafficante whose name kept popping up? And how did he get himself involved with both of these conspiracies?
He had these piercing green eyes that could look right through your soul. And that's the type of person, if he wanted to be, he could be a ruthless killer. He could turn on you instantly and whack someone and no problem at all.
Chris Regano is the son of Trafficante's longtime lawyer, Frank Regano, and has had direct contact with Trafficante.
He could order his guys, his lieutenants, his capos, whatever it was, to whack someone. There's no doubt about it. He can do that.
Author Scott Dietschy.
By the late 1970s, Trafficante was still considered the boss of the Tampa Mafia and still an influential figure not only in the mob scene in Florida, but nationally.
Santo Trafficante had inherited the Florida mob from his father. Trafficante Sr. was an old-fashioned tough mobster, notorious for eliminating his enemies, regardless of their profiles or reputations.
So around the late 1940s, around 1950, Santo Trafficante Sr., who took over the mafia in Tampa in 1940, started transferring power over to his son, Santo Jr. It's pretty unusual for mafia bosses to hand control over to the sons.
Trafficante Jr. had learned from a young age that if someone crosses you, no matter how high up they are, you get rid of them. A few years earlier, Trafficante Sr. had his supremacy challenged by a gangster called Jimmy Lumia. Lumia got whacked proper mafia style. He was talking in the street when a gunman stepped out of a car, shot him several times, and then drove off. All this despite the fact that Lumia was a well-known figure in Florida, a close friend of the mayor even. But along with his ruthless reputation, Trafficante was also a mediator, and quickly built up his empire by connecting to other major mafia families.
Yeah, one of the really unique and interesting things is the Tampa Mafia family is always pretty small, much smaller than some of the New York, Chicago, Detroit families. But Santo Trafficante Jr. really started building the family up in the 1950s. He starts showing up at these major underworld events in New York.
Tampa was small, but the newly crowned young mobster boss was ambitious. He saw an opportunity to expand his gambling operations, a potential gold mine sitting just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. In the early 1950s, Cuba was America's gambling paradise and whorehouse. The country was run by ex-General Fulgencio Batista, who also saw profit in the hedonistic playground. So Batista and the Mafia struck a deal. Operating completely free of American regulations, mobsters invested heavily in casinos and hotels in Cuba, where they would have no trouble with the authorities. Here's Scott Dietschy again.
The appeal of Cuba was that it a very corruptible government at that time, and the mob was able to parlay that into a pretty lavish casino industry. You have to remember, this is kind of in the pre-Las Vegas years, where this big casino industry starts. It's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It's a foreign government and a friendly government, which I think was certainly attractive to organized crime.
It was a deal with the Fulgencio Batista, who was a dictator. They kicked back every night, presumably 10% of the earnings from these casinos, but nobody knows what the real take was. And it was a tropical paradise.
In the mid-50s, Santo Trafficante relocated to Cuba to oversee his growing casino and nightclub business. With his own connections, he became the facilitator for other crime families to move in on the deal. The city of Tampa already had strong community ties with Cuba, giving Trafficante an advantage over other mobsters. He was also the only one who could speak fluent Spanish.
The Tampa Mafia had ties to Cuba for a very specific reason. The section of Tampa, Ybor City, where a lot of the Sicilians lived, was also home to the oldest Cuban population in the state of Florida, as well as a Spanish population. Trafficante and the Tampa guys, they spoke Spanish, which a lot of the New York and Philly, Boston mobsters who were operating in Cuba didn't.
One of the aspects that's not known about Santo Trafficante was that he was really the major domo and the major figure in gambling in Havana. He was in charge. He had interest in 5 casinos. He raked in millions all the time.
Crime author Thomas Repetto.
And it was a booming place for the Mafia. But Trafficante had the establishment, the connections. He knew the people in Cuba in the 1950s. He was all set there. Because Cuba was important, Trafficante became important.
The casinos weren't the only money-making industry out on the island either. There was a new and even more lucrative market emerging: narcotics. It was only a short flight from Cuba, easy and fast to smuggle drugs into the U.S. And all the action took place right in Trafficante's backyard.
The Trafficante family had gotten there first. They had made the inroads and they were plugged in. So even if you got the northern mobsters coming down, they were second bananas to the Trafficante family in Cuba.
I want to tell you about eliquid.com. It is by far the easiest way to shop for all your vaping needs. In one spot, anytime. They have over 44,000 items in stock and ready to go, like e-liquid, hardware, tanks, replacement coils, atomizers, batteries, vape accessories, and do-it-yourself supplies. And their website does a great job making it easy to find what you're looking for, even on mobile. My favorite part of the site is the Beginner's Guide to Vaping, full of safety tips and a full dictionary of vaping terminology. I'm definitely a beginner, so it's good to learn about some of these out-there terms. Here's a quiz. Do you know what a box mod is? How about a Genesis atomizer? Sub-ohming. I'm still not sure what that is, but I can find out on the site. eLiquid.com will ship what you need when you need it. The last order I placed shipped out the same day. They even have vape agents there who were able to help me. So be sure to check out eLiquid.com for everything vape, simplified. And they've got a special offer for Mafia listeners. You'll get 20% off your first purchase when you visit eLiquid.com/Mafia and use promo code MAFIA during checkout. That's ELIQUID.com/Mafia, promo code MAFIA for 20% off your first order. By 1958, Trafficante was making so much money between his Cuban casinos and the growing drug trade that he could be set up for life. But a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro was waging a guerrilla war against the government, threatening to overthrow the lax General Batista. Castro's revolution, and a communist revolution no less, could put Trafficante's empire in jeopardy. Trafficante cared little for politics, but he did care about his profits. Like a gambler covering all the angles, he quickly took steps to secure his investments, to ensure that Castro's revolutionary ambitions didn't threaten to derail his gravy train. In fact, Trafficante already knew Fidel Castro personally. Scott Dietschy.
In the years before the revolution, Castro had come to Tampa, Ybor City, a number of times to do fundraising and speaking events, and there's a lot of lore says that he, when he came to town, he would meet with the Trafficantes as well.
Trafficante secured a deal with Castro. Even if the revolution succeeded, Castro guaranteed that for the mob in Cuba, it would be business as usual. Chris Regano.
Trafficante definitely was hedging his bets. He was paying off the Batista officials and the government, but at the same time, he was giving money to the guerrillas and to Castro and their causes. Trafficante believed that they were just radicals, that they were just up in the mountains and the jungles.
But as the violence escalated, the war started to affect his earnings. Gamblers were deserting the casinos in Cuba altogether. Mob bosses started to fold up and leave the island nation. Trafficante, however, was holding his nerve.
Trafficante thought he really knew the Cuban political situation, and he wasn't worried about a revolution. In fact, he imparted to some people that he'd been paying off indirectly to the Castro people. He was making sure he was crossing his bets on both sides. So he had no concern. He thought the revolution might look dynamic and might look bloody for a little while every other mob figure bolted back to the U.S. He stayed put. He felt secure.
When it became evident that they were not going to be able to stay in Cuba, Trafficante was probably one of the last few folks to leave. I mean, all his buddies, everyone was pulling out. They're getting out of Cuba because they could see the writing on the wall. Trafficante felt that since he was more of someone who had that background, that he was Italian, he could speak fluent Spanish, he was, living in Florida, and he had more of that relationship that somehow he could schmooze his way back in.
On January 1st, 1959, General Batista fled Cuba. Castro's guerrillas had beaten the government's army and took control of the island. And Trafficante finally realized that he had seriously miscalculated the situation.
He thought he knew the territory. He was wrong.
Trafficante had always thought, look, you just buy your way out of anything down here. But Castro was a little different fellow.
Little did he know that Fidel Castro and all of his radicals didn't support anything that they were doing. So he waited too long to get out of Cuba.
Trafficante felt he had been double-crossed, and that was something he wouldn't tolerate or forget. But with Castro proclaiming victory, shutting down his business was the least of his troubles. As a known Batista collaborator, there was a strong possibility Trafficante would be detained. He knew that he had to get off the island as soon as possible. Scott Dici.
Trafficante really thinks he's going to be okay because of his ties and this playing both sides during this conflict, but Castro has other things in mind and actually jails Trafficante in Triscornia Detention Center in 1959.
Inside the detention center, Trafficante realized that it wasn't just his criminal empire that was in danger. His very life was at risk behind these bars. Men were disappearing from the cells around him every day. He could be next.
You could hear the execution firing squads taking care of Castro's enemies.
They were going to execute him. I mean, that's how close it came for him not making it out of Cuba.
Trafficante had to get out and fast, but he couldn't do it alone. And so he reached out to one of his long-term allies, New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello. Coincidentally, around the time Trafficante was in jail, Carlos Marcello's bagman, Jack Ruby, had been making frequent trips to Cuba. Professor G. Robert Blakey wondered if there was a tie-in here. Could Jack Ruby have been trying to get Santo Trafficante out of jail?
Now we know that Jack Ruby made quick trips from Cuba to Miami and back that have no explanation if he was just a tourist. In all likelihood is that he may well have taken some of Trafficante's money out of Cuba to put back in the United States, but that's speculation rather than evidence. So,
2 months after his arrest by Castro, Trafficante was suddenly and unexpectedly released from Cuban jail.
He shouldn't have gotten out, period. End of story. How did he get out? Well, he got out the way everybody gets out, illicitly, by paying a bribe. That's the best explanation.
There's little doubt that he got out the very simple way. He bribed his way.
But years later, when Trafficante was testifying in front of the House Select Committee about the assassination of JFK, he claimed on several occasions that he didn't know Jack Ruby, and that he had never met him. It seemed that if the connection did in fact exist, Trafficante understood the danger of linking himself to Jack Ruby. Meanwhile, the committee was trying to join the dots.
Trafficante denied it, and denied that he knew Jack Ruby. But there's every reason to disbelieve Trafficante on it.
There's no doubt that Santo Trafficante knew about Jack Ruby, mainly because Ruby had been connected to Carlos Marcello in Louisiana, and that he'd been running money mainly for Carlos Marcello out of Cuba. But for the main part, nobody's ever put the two of them together. Nobody's ever put Santo Trafficante having any direct deals with Jack Ruby.
Out of prison, Trafficante saw that Cuba wasn't safe for him anymore and was no longer the paradise it once had been. He had lost everything, the casinos, the customers, and this time, he didn't take any more risks. He left the island, unsure if he would ever return.
Trafficante felt that it was just a temporary situation, that ultimately Castro would only be there on a temporary basis and that he would go back into Cuba. It's just only a matter of time. So he was devastated. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They thought that it was just something that would be a matter of years and they could get back into Cuba and they can start rolling in the money again. So he did not think that this was going to be a long-term situation.
But Trafficante would never recover any of his multi-million-dollar investments. Here's Selwyn Rabb.
He felt he was a big loser. He had more casinos than anybody else, 5 of them. It took millions out of his pocket. And from his point of view, the Cuban Revolution was a disaster.
The gambling empire Trafficante had helped build in Cuba now shifted west to Bugsy Siegel's Las Vegas. Even worse, mob bosses across the United States who had invested in Trafficante's Cuban haven now wanted their money back. And Trafficante's seat at the Mafia top table had been taken from him. In Trafficante's mind, there was only one man to blame for his downfall.
Santo never forgave Castro. One of his biggest aims in life was getting back to Cuba. And one of the ways he wanted to get back to Cuba was displacing and getting rid of Castro. He would have done anything he could possibly to do it.
To his luck, he wasn't the only one with a grudge against Fidel Castro. In Key West, Florida, anti-communist feelings were mounting. There was anger among Cuban communities. Castro was hanged in effigy in street protests. Anti-Castro forces were beginning to join hands in other cities.
Trafficante kind of builds around himself this little mob of Cuban gangsters who also left the island when Batista fell. And this whole anti-Castro fervor starts reaching a fever pitch in South Florida at that time.
Trafficante's own involvement in the anti-Castro movement garnered the attention of some very powerful allies up north. In September 1960, Trafficante was approached by a man with a message from the Chicago mobster Sam Giancana. Giancana wanted to enroll Trafficante in one of the most high-profile hits the Mafia had ever gotten, Fidel Castro. But it wasn't Giancana himself who was authorizing the hit. In fact, the contract didn't come from the Mafia at all. It was from the CIA. In the next episode.
When the U.S. government was looking for somebody to assassinate Castro, they said, well, who are good assassins? They said, the Mafia.
Conspiracies abound in the House Select Committee on Assassinations. How did the CIA get into bed with a mob to get rid of Castro?
It just shows you the respect that law enforcement had for the Mafia. They could get things done in a way that law enforcement or legitimate operations could not.
And Trafficante continues his involvement in a web of intrigue and clandestine operations that potentially link him to one of the most notorious assassinations in United States history, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
So because of Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime, a lot of mobsters start having some pretty bad feelings towards John F. Kennedy. And this goes across the country, from Carlos Marcello in New Orleans to Sam Giancana to the bosses in New York.
This has been an Audio Boom and World Media Rights co-production, hosted by me, Fleet Cooper. It is produced by Audio Boom's Ben Hosley and Rachel Jacobs, and Bettina Vasquez for World Media Rights. We had editing help from David Markowitz, with additional production from World Media Rights by Gerald Zabingwa. David McNabb is the series' creative director, and the executive producers for Audio Boom are Brendan Reagan and Stuart Last. Thanks to Indochino for sponsoring this episode. Follow Mafia on Spotify, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite shows.